welcome and greetings, and we're delighted that you're here. I'm Bob Yarrow. I'm president of Regional Plan Association in New York, and I'm co-chair of America 2050, which is a national coalition of business and civic groups that have been looking at this idea of emerging mega regions and how they can develop strategies for success, and as we've learned today, for happiness. We've got a very diverse group of folks here from across the Texas Triangle. We heard yesterday morning from a number of national speakers about the emergence of mega regions, these networks of metropolitan areas. 11 of them across the United States. Texas Triangle is one. These are networks of metropolitan areas that share economies, that share big infrastructure systems, and one of the newest of these are the proposals for high-speed rail here in Texas and across the country. They share big natural resource systems, things like the aquifers and the rivers that provide public water supplies for Texas cities and regions. The other thing they share, I guess, is that across the country we don't have the governance systems, we don't have we don't have state governments here in Texas or in California, which has 2 mega regions, or where I live in the Northeast, where we have 14 states in the Northeast mega region. We don't have systems for collaboration. But what we're seeing are emerging partnerships, coalitions, alliances. In the Northeast, for example, we have a business alliance for Northeast Mobility, representing 35 business groups, regional chambers of commerce from Maine to Virginia, that are working together on mobility strategies in the Northeast. So we've heard from a number of speakers about the emerging Texas Triangle and the resources, the issues that it shares, the economic challenges that it faces, and so forth. And I think we just went through this exercise with these keypads to see if we can agree on the elements of a vision for the future of the Texas Triangle. And David, you may want to report on that too. I don't know how many of you were here to see that, the end of that process. And you might want to report on just on that little piece of it, okay? Anyway, so welcome, and we're delighted that you're here, and then we'll get a report. David, you probably do as good a job as anybody reporting on the outcomes of this little voting that we just went through.
We looked at the notion of seeing this region as a sustainable mega region of multiple clusters of cities, towns, and neighborhoods. And I'll just try to give you the words. Successful was in there, jobs and opportunity are in there, equity and opportunity. Equity is in there, agricultural preservation. It's hard. These visions ultimately are the same after people get through everywhere, because the issues are the same everywhere. So it's a very large vision that has to do with success. And one of the pieces we added to it that I thought was pretty interesting was the notion of well-being, health and safety and well-being. And earlier this morning we had this long discussion about happiness, which was pretty fruitful, I think, discussion. So that vision is out there, and we'll be trying to put it together. And that was sort of unfair the way you were introduced, because no cards attached to name. At the left up here is Judge Ed Emmett of Harris County. Next to him, Fort Worth Councilmember Jungus Jordan. Sarah Eckhardt, whose famous name in Texas, as you all know, and is from Travis County Commissioner. And Ben White, who's the mayor of College Station, and Miya Shay from Channel 13. Thank you all.
All right, thank you so much. Hey, how's everyone doing? Well, are we well caffeinated? I know it's like 2 o'clock, you had lunch, you're on that mode, you're like, maybe it's time for a nap, but no naps. We're gonna talk about mega regions and MetroProsperity. I was going to do the introductions, but you did a great job. We have some fine folks here. They're going to talk a little bit about their views of the Texas Triangle and transportation and the rail lines, if we'll ever get any here around. We've got a series of questions, but I want to start out with, these are all very knowledgeable individuals, each with their own kind of worldview and unique views of Texas. So we'll just have them each give a few minutes of their thoughts about where they see rail in the Texas Triangle and in this region, their kind of vision. I'm sure it'll all differ a little bit, and then we'll kind of go from there. We'll start at my far right, man I know well, Judge Ed Emmett.
Thank you, Maya. How long do I have?
However long you want,
No,
within reason.
I won't do that. Rail clearly is going to be part of the future of what we're finally calling the Texas Triangle. The problem is, and hopefully in the next hour or so, I'll say some things that are just downright controversial that'll make some of these people argue with me, and we'll go from there. If you go back 30 years to when I first went to the Texas House of Representatives, high-speed rail's been around pretty much the whole time, and it's transitioned. And the problem is, as was pointed out, there's no single focus of who's going to do it. And so as a result, we find ourselves now, if you go out on the street, and I've polled the issue, people say, yeah, that's a good idea. Right up to the point when you start talking about who's going to do it, how's it going to be done, where's it going to go. So, and this is certainly no knock on the T-bone, but the T-bone came about because people gave up on the triangle itself and said, well, we can cut the distance in half by going to a T-bone. Here lately, though, I think a lot of us were shocked, but it's our fault. We didn't pay attention. The federal government suddenly says, we're really interested in high-speed rail. We're going to fund it. And then we all rush to see what the federal high-speed rail map looks like for Texas. And Houston is only connected to New Orleans. Doesn't go west or north, either one. And you go, well, that's one of the stupidest things I've ever seen. How'd that happen? I don't know. Some of the other panelists may know how that happened. But so clearly we have a lot of work to do. Well, from my point of view, we are forever being hit with opportunities. And if we don't take advantage of those opportunities, shame on us. Here locally, the Union Pacific has now come forward and said they're willing to give up their freight service, that's a loose term, on the State Highway 3 line to Galveston and on the Hempstead line from Eureka Yards in northwest Houston to Hempstead. And we could put commuters on there. Well, that's a good idea. We need commuter rail. We're already having little spats over, well, who gets to do the studies and who gets to do this. And at the end of the day, all I care about, what's the entity that's going to put trains on the tracks? I don't care who the consultant is, just who's going to put the train on the track and actually put people in that train. Well, the good news is, at least on the Northwest line, all the communities are really excited. And the commissioner from Travis County may not even be fully aware of this. When we started talking about running commuter trains to Hempstead, College Station was always in the mix as a logical place to go with it also. But then I got approached by Mr. Sheehan from Elgin, who said, well, we're already talking about running them to Giddings. Well, if you run a train to Giddings and we run one to Hempstead, it doesn't take a genius to figure out the right-of-way is still pretty much intact from Giddings to Hempstead, goes through Brenham. People in Brenham are excited. And I know we're really talking about high speed and we're talking about the triangle, but probably the best rail route in the state of Texas is Houston to Austin, because the city pairs too close to fly. We've all made that trip. You know, by the time you go to the airport and go through security and all that, you say, oh, heck, I'll drive. So in my mind, you know, that route could get started. Along about the same time now, the BNSF, and I don't know how many people have even heard this, it hadn't been announced publicly, but BNSF has now come forward and said, well, you know what, we'd be willing to get off what's called our Teague line, and that's the line from Houston up through Corsicana to Dallas, and it's the shortest route between Houston and Dallas. So suddenly, if that line's available, it would be a shame if we didn't take advantage of that, and even though it might not match up with what the T-bone necessarily wants to do, if we could get that high-speed rail going early, particularly now that we're in a place where whether they have the money or not doesn't seem to matter, but the federal government seems to be willing to throw money at these types of things, then we ought to take advantage of it. But at the end, let me just leave you with this, and I'll certainly weigh in with comments and questions as we go. Whatever we do with commuter rail in and out of the Houston area, we need to make sure that it's a precursor to high-speed rail. And that's why using the existing freight beds is probably a good start because they're already going to be a little bit stronger. It keeps us from getting off into the weeds of transit, if you will. And we need to start focusing, and this is where some of the controversy comes from. We need to start focusing on the FRA process, Federal Railroad Administration process, rather than the FTA process. Because if you're talking about high-speed passenger rail, ultimately, you need to be going through FRA. So those are just my thoughts. I think rail is definitely going to happen. I turned 60 this past summer, and I truly believe we will have passenger rail operating in the state of Texas in my lifetime.
Yeah, but you're going to have a long and fantastic lifetime. You know, 95. Councilmember Jordan, would you like to give us your thoughts?
Sure. First, let me say I am very, very happy.
About that it's Friday?
So I think I was on the far left-hand side of your chart. For those that don't know, I had the infamous pleasure of being the chair of Rail North Texas, which became known later in the legislature as the Texas Local Option Transportation Act. The purpose of that started to be the funding of regional commuter rail in Dallas-Fort Worth area. When you start talking about mega regions, let me start out by saying to some degree we're all unique, but when you talk about Dallas-Fort Worth and our metropolitan planning area, if you look at the 6 major counties, Dallas County, Tarrant County, Johnson County, Ellis County, Collin County, and Denton County, there are over 250 jurisdictions within that area. So when you add to that the triangle and talk about the number of jurisdictions we're going to be dealing with, it's huge. You talk a lot about vision. It's very easy and very frustrating for me because I have a vision, I just don't understand why everybody doesn't sign up to it. And I say that jokingly, but the thing about it is I think most of us share that vision of rail and the future of rail. The question comes to whether it be high-speed rail, commuter rail, light rail, streetcars, modern streetcars in the region, and we're talking of a system in the North Texas area, a system of about 400 total miles of commuter rail. When you talk about that, the issue is who's going to pay for it? And that's what the TLATA was all about, was an attempt to get the legislature to give us some local options to pay for local transportation issues or to supplement local transportation issues. It was the second time, it was my first time to go to the legislature with that issue. I think we made significant progress. There were a lot of things accomplished during that session. We've got a little ways to go, and we're going to go back, and I think we're going to be able to sell to the legislature to give local counties and cities more flexibility in being able to be part of the process. I think we're going to get there. The issue of how are you going to pay for it, that question is easy to answer, because the real answer is we're going to pay for it one way or the other. We're going to pay for it through lost jobs, lost quality of life, lost environment, lack of clean air. All of the things that you listed as part of the vision and the purpose of changing the way we do things, we're going to pay for it. Or probably more realistically, our children and grandchildren are going to pay for it, and they're going to pay a bigger dollar than we pay. So we have to find a way to solve it, and I agree with Judge Emmett. I think it's in the next few years that we are going to see a system of commuter rail, high-speed rail, that connects the mega triangle. What was interesting as we started out the Rail North Texas exercise, how quickly we found out that while we as cities and counties sometimes compete with each other, all of the issues we're dealing with are the same, whether it be urban, rural, city, county, big city, small city. All we're talking about is a difference in the number of zeros at the end of the problem that we're trying to deal with. And the problem doesn't end at city limits lines. It's over the entire state. I think the more and more we can talk and meet like this, we have a vision in North Texas. The work that Karen Walls and our COG has done, we know what we want. In what Fort Worth is going to do, for those that are not familiar with TLOTA, what we were essentially asking for was the local authority to hold a bond package to pay for specific projects. And we were asking for greater authority in a list of revenue sources. Well, right now, a city really only has 2 or 3 revenue sources, and those are fairly defined by the state. In May of this year, the city of Fort Worth is going to hold a bond election, and we're going to go to the voters with a list of projects and ask them to choose between property tax increase or a transportation fee, which is within our authority to do. We're going to tell them what the project is, and we're going to tell them what the costs are. And we'll see, we're going to test the concept of local option transportation and to see if we can get the citizens to sign on to the solutions. So I am happy to be here.
Thank you so much. Commissioner Eckhardt, you're writing furiously. You must have a lot to say.
I just have a habit of taking notes. And the coffee's making me very happy, thanks. Just to kind of gauge the audience, because I'm figuring I'm speaking to the choir here. How many people are in favor of regional rail throughout the mega triangle? I had a sneaking suspicion I was speaking to the choir. Well, good news. Let's all jump up and down and do the rah-rah. I want to make a full-throated rah-rah along with Jungus. I, too, was very engaged in advocating for the local option transportation funding bill, as many of us were throughout the state of Texas in the major metropolitan regions. We too were very much looking forward to having another revenue source, because I'm going to skip what I was going to say, because y'all already know it. The population of Texas is condensing around a corridor between north of Dallas down to Laredo. We can't afford to build the transportation infrastructure for single occupant vehicles. You know, where we're building a toll road that's 7 miles long for $630 million, we could be building 26 miles of passenger rail for less than $200 million. So y'all all know all of that, right? So I'm done, basically. What we now need to move on to is how do we pay for it? Travis County and our MPO, I think all of us sit on our MPOs. Are we all up here are MPOers? We were sort of caught with our pants down on the ERA funding. We don't have in our long-range plan a single, despite the fact that we're Central Texas and we're supposed to be so hip and up to the moment, we didn't have a single commuter rail project except for the ASA, the Austin San Antonio Rail Project, in our long-range plan. So we were not positioned to pull down any of those federal dollars. Luckily, our Senator Watson pulled down, is it $180 million for the Austin San Antonio Rail District? For the relocation fund? But Susan Combs has not yet certified it. Correct?
Absolutely correct.
And that is a little disturbing. We have pretty much the only options for us are bonds, which essentially are borrowing on your property tax in the future, and tax increment financing, which is also borrowing on your property tax for the future. We really do need this third way, this local option transportation funding bill to pass next time. And we'll need everybody in this room and more to beat down the notion that this is just another tax and more big government. It is another tax. I'll be frank with you. It is another tax. But there is no rail ferry. It most definitely is another tax. But that's how you pay for social infrastructure. And it is not big government. It's government at the local level, where we would be responsible for putting the package together, putting it on the ballot, and then convincing the very folks that would have to pay for it that it is the right thing to do. So I'm calling on y'all to help us out on that local option funding, because the feds are running low on cash. The state refuses to tax, so it doesn't have any cash. It's government has devolved down to us in this room.
Mayor?
Thank you. Like Sarah, I also like to sort of gauge the audience that I'm talking with, so I do this in my traditional way. Howdy. Howdy. Good. We got some Aggies here. That's good. I feel at home now. That's great. Let me. My remarks will be very brief because, as Sarah said and the others have said, we are indeed preaching and talking with the choir. Let me give you a snapshot real quickly of College Station, and hopefully we'll share with you why we are so engaged and involved in the high-speed rail movement. We are a community today of about 92, right at 93,000 people. We have 48,000 students at Texas A&M University. Our sister city to the north, Bryan, is a community of about 76,000, and they have a community college of 13,000 students. So you start doing the numbers of the people living in the county, and we are indeed a growing community. In the case of College Station, without any question at all, we've just gone through the process. The number one issue is transportation. We're growing at a rate that the city financially doesn't have the ability to keep up with the infrastructure, even though the numbers would be small to my colleagues here on the panel. We right now need around $120 million just to bring us current of what our needs are. And that would be doing nothing with future needs. So we have, as a community, we've embraced the concept of high-speed rail. We certainly have embraced the concept of the T-bone configuration for many reasons, one of which would be that coming with the military. We tend to be, with A&M's tradition and background, we tend to be a little militaristic. We know that Fort Hood and the U.S. Department of Defense is very concerned about their ability to get their troops and material from Fort Hood down to the Port of Houston or Port of Beaumont. So this, when they tee off at Temple Killeen to go east through College Station into Houston, is very important to us. So we see this also, quite honestly, as an economic generator. We think the whole configuration of our community will change. We think we will probably have people who will desire to live in a smaller environment, yet their jobs will necessitate them commuting into Houston, to Dallas, and with the availability, or Austin, I should say, and with the availability of the high-speed rail, that's going to be accomplished in a much easier fashion than it is today. So all in all, we do support this concept, and I would be happy to answer questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you guys. I'm just going to help facilitate some questions, but this is going to probably be pretty free-flowing. I'll pose some questions. You guys feel free to jump in. Just no fist fights among the panelists. Other than that, anything goes. But I think, here in Houston, for example, we've had the light rail. I guess they opened that one line 6 years ago, and really nothing has happened. And in the meantime, other countries around the world, even developing countries, have managed to build high-speed rail to various cities, especially for their populations. They kind of almost skipped over us, and we're supposed to be the most developed country in the world. And with everybody on the panel saying that in general, this high-speed rail is a good idea, but when you talk about fees and taxes, it tends to be politically unpopular, and all of you are elected officials. How do you kind of get that together and actually get it moving beyond the, yay, it's great stage, which seems to be like at the permanent stage? Councilmember, you want to start?
I'll be happy to, thank you. I'm going to start out by saying I'm a conservative and not talk partisan politics, but what made this acceptable to me because I'm sort of a no new tax guy, was that we are putting the decision through TLATA in the hands of the user, the citizen, and that's where government's supposed to be. And I think if we do a good job in demonstrating the need, even though we fell short this legislative session, I think we made some significant strides. TxDOT has created a railroad department that they're hiring for now. We got the, yeah, me too. We passed the Texas Relocation Act. We've got some awareness, if you will, among the community. And I think what we need to do is put the final decision in the hand of the voter. And I can live with that. And I think that's the only way you solve any issue in the United States of America. But I think we have to do a good job selling, because all of the things we talked about, whether it be economic development, happiness, the job availability, everything you talk about comes down to one thing, and that's infrastructure. The mobility and air quality is dependent on infrastructure. And I don't know how many have seen the History Channel's documentary called The Crumbling of America. But in The Crumbling of America, they identified that although we are one of the leading nations in the world, most of the infrastructure in our nation is at least 60 years old. Some of it is over 100 years old. And it's fallen apart, whether it be the supply of water, sewer, roads, bridges, dams, they're crumbling. And the price tag in the next 5 years that I heard was $3.5 trillion in need to replace failing infrastructure in the nation. I don't know how else you pay for it than have the citizens step up to do that.
Do you think Harris County voters would approve of that? What do you think, Judge?
Well, before I answer the serious policy question, let me take great exception to something Commissioner Eckhardt said. Having watched the season premiere of The Good Wife this week, I have never been caught with my pants down. Just want that clear out there. I don't want anything on the public record here that Miya could pick up on, put in her blog or anything of the sort.
Wearing a skirt, I can probably get away with
You
that.
can get away with that. No, in all seriousness, I could spend a long time, as many of you in this room could, talking about the missed opportunities in Harris County. You look at Interstate 10, which, you know, now is, I don't know, a mile wide or something. It's a very wide highway out there. Wonderful project, completed ahead of time and under budget, but there used to be a rail track that paralleled Interstate 10. And the entity that turned down the opportunity to actually take that rail track was Metro. And you look back on that and think, you know, you're in the mass transit business and you turn down a right-of-way that leads to the most populated parts of your county.
But what about there was that local group who wanted rail to like sink in the middle, in between the highways? Was that just a far-fetched?
Well, yeah, and I don't want to get into, I don't want to turn this, oh my gosh, I don't want to turn this into a criticism of Metro. They're doing what they're doing. They've made their decisions for whatever reason. But at the same time, when we start talking about going to commuter rail, for example, Metro has a limited geographic scope. The local option tax, that's okay, but that's not going to help us do commuter rail unless we find a way to have an entity that goes into the other counties. And right now what we've got is the Gulf Coast Rail District, which Waller County, Harris County, Fort Bend, and Galveston County all belong to. They have no taxing jurisdiction. So somehow we'd have to tie the local option tax to that entity or create yet another entity. And Harris County has a long history of having very, very close contested elections when it comes to entities, whether it's Metro or whether it's a sports authority or anything else. They're very controversial, and that's going to be the biggest problem we face. I think, yeah, everybody will say, well, local option, that sounds good. But who's going to administer it?
I mean, do you get like a statewide referendum? You got to convince everybody around the state to kind of march in step, sort of, Mayor?
You know, what we do in College Station, and a little bit different from probably what you folks are encountering, we talk a lot about the need for a paradigm shift. We have to change our thinking. We've got to get our people in our community out of the mindset that they go everywhere in their own vehicle, and they need to start thinking.
But this is Texas. You can't tell.
Well, that's what we have to do. You know, I was in Germany and Spain riding the high-speed rail, and that's the first mode of transportation that people think about over there. And I imagine it at the end of the day, it'll probably be much the same here. If your trip is 400 miles or less, it's high-speed rail. If it's between 400, 500 or more, you fly. And that's their rule of thumb. And that's what their mindset is just simply mass transportation like this. So that's, in our area, that's what we're going to have to overcome, is this change in mindset and get people thinking about getting out of their automobiles, out of their pickup trucks, and into some form of mass transportation.
I mean, optimistically, Commissioner, what do you think the most, I mean, when will we actually see something, anything in the state?
Oh, we'll see quite a bit of action. We're actually rail rich in this state in the corridor that we're talking about. In the Austin MSA alone, we have the MoCan corridor, the MoPac corridor, the Llano-Giddings line, which you were speaking about, Judge Emmett. We have the Austin-San Antonio rail line. These are all pre-existing rail lines. It's rail that's sitting there waiting to be utilized. But the issue is the funding necessary to move the freight off of those lines so that you can utilize it. Now that's not high-speed rail,
right,
as you propose, Mayor, but it does get us a little further down the road in regard to rail transportation for the masses, at least in the Dallas, at least in the Austin, San Antonio area. And I'm from Houston. I know that Houston also has a good amount of pre-existing rail infrastructure. It's a port city. So I think we're going to see it, and we're going to see it rather fast. We're living in a circumstance where...
Like fast, like 5 years fast, or like 20 years fast?
You know, we're probably talking 10 years fast. Because what we have here, from an international perspective, we are seeing developing countries like China that are in a circumstance where they've saved too much and are afraid to borrow. We have borrowed too much and are afraid to save. I think that we are going to contract on our infrastructure and start spending it in ways that have, as you say, Mayor, we're going to start spending it in ways that several people can double dip on the same dollar. And on highways, we predominantly drive single occupant vehicle. And so we're going to start looking at ways to maximize the infrastructure that we have, rather than building brand new, out-of-the-box, large stretches, 12 lanes wide of concrete. We simply can't afford it any longer. We're going to look at the existing infrastructure and figure out how to move more people and things on what we have. Now, I want to go back to something else that Judge Emmett said, the multiplicity of transportation entities. You hit the nail on the head. I mean, our desire for a local option transportation tax and or transportation fee, or whatever you want to call it, to pretty it up to not call it a tax. You're absolutely right. The nut of it is who collects it and how is it distributed. And what that comes down to, and I'm a bomb thrower, I'm not a conservative, I'm a liberal, so I can do these kinds of things. We are recreating TxDOT at the local level, because TxDOT has dropped the ball. We have a statewide entity that could take the money and distribute it, but they're not. I'm very happy that they have created a rail department, but I don't have high hopes that anything will come of it. The rail departments that will actually get you on a train in the next 10 years will exist in Fort Worth, in Austin, Texas, in Round Rock and Pflugerville and Georgetown, Texas, in Killeen and College Station. They will not exist in TxDOT's rail department. And where they're going to get the funding is from those of us who live around those areas. It's not going to come from a statewide gas tax. The fraidy cats in the Pink Dome are absolutely terrified to touch that, excuse the pun, third rail.
Judge, you think?
Yeah, I was going to weigh in with and now I'm going to do something even different. First, let me talk about what I was going to talk about. How many of you have traveled regularly between Houston and Austin? How many of you would take a train if it was available? And I know that this is a friendly audience for that, but that one makes just so much sense. I mean, for a lot of reasons. I mean, people going back and forth to the legislature, people going back to state agencies, young people, you know, Miya would spend Saturday nights on 6th Street on a regular basis, I'm sure. And if you could do a train and come back.
Austin needs your sales tax.
So, but there again, that becomes the question of what's the entity that's going to do it? And I think that might be the perfect one for TxDOT. Senator Watts and I are on a regulatory advisory committee right now, trying to get TxDOT ahead of the curve, because they're going to get beat up again in the next legislative session unless they start doing something different. So if they have this rail department, and if they can take on a meaningful project other than the South Orient Railroad, which goes across West Texas from nowhere to nowhere at 5 miles an hour, then that could help, I think, the image of TxDOT a great deal. But for those of you who have not heard, we have a local state senator, Dan Patrick. And 3 weeks ago, he stood up and he gave a speech, and I was there, and Chairman DeLisi from TxDOT was there, and a whole 300 people or so. And he said the time has come to increase the gasoline tax and to index it for inflation. Now, I followed him by saying, you know, that's a profile in courage, because he is one of those conservative leaders that the House members all look to and say, what's he going to do? And I'm not here to
I thought they just listened to it on his radio show.
And I'm not here to make announcements for him, but he said it in public, and the Chronicle was there, and the channel, another channel was there, one of the lesser TV channels was there. But there is a mindset change going on in the legislature. I truly believe it. And so I think if we can identify a few key projects and get the legislators' attention, and the one complaint I heard about the local option tax from some people here, and keep in mind we have our own toll road authority, and we're able to spin off additional revenue that builds free roads. But the one thing was there were too many options, and they wanted to narrow the options. And I've told them, you're in the legislature, you pick what makes sense that raises the revenue, and we'll run with it. And I think you probably feel the same way. I mean, we don't want to tell them exactly what to do, but just give us some flexibility so that we can meet the needs. And the final thing I'm going to say is, yes, we are rail corridor rich here, but and some of you may be in this room. Do any of you live in the Heights? Do you want a train coming through the Heights? See, I'm proud of you for saying that. Because most people there, if you took a poll, would say, no, we don't want trains going back on that right of way. But yet, a lot of the same people there, and I know this is an overgeneralization, will tell you they're for commuter rail. Just don't let it come through my neighborhood. That's right. But unfortunately, trains have to go on tracks, and they tend to stay pretty close to those tracks. And if you've already got a rail bed somewhere, that's what you ought to use.
So do you really think, does the leadership need to come from the bottom up, like you guys were talking about, from each local entity, or do you think some sort of change in leadership on top, from the governor on down, do you think that would help in kind of moving this forward, or do you think that matters at this point?
Well, my response to that relative back to high-speed rail is, and I think you mentioned about 30 years ago this issue was being approached, but it was a top-down situation 20, 30 years ago where the federal government was trying to work it down. That obviously didn't work. This time it's a bottom-up where it's starting at the local level, and you're seeing some success, and now you're seeing buy-in and engagement by the federal government. They now have seen the need to begin to think about this type of transportation.
How hard is it to turn the tide? Because you do hear a lot of people saying, you know, they want to be in their cars. They don't want in their, you know, the whole NIMBY syndrome. Not in my backyard. I want to have my car, but I want the choice to be on the rail, but not too close.
But that's not unique to the issue of rail. I mean, we face that whenever we build a road. We face it whenever we locate a landfill. We face it whenever we're looking for a good pad site for a homeless shelter. These are not issues that are unique to rail and shouldn't deter us in our movement toward what is quite obviously the most efficient and environmentally sound way to move the population that is getting more dense in this corridor in Texas.
So is it realistically, you think, to do commuter rail first or high speed, or can they both be done at the same time? What do you think the order of things should be?
Well, in my mind, first they can be done at both the same time. And
How would
the way, of course, it sort of goes back to I have a vision, why can't everybody else see my vision?
Yeah, I'm sure you're right?
Yeah, I'm right.
Just get over this and go on.
But to me, for example, and I think the judge and the commissioner both touched on it, in one of the problems that we addressed, that we identified, because we started out with TLATA as a North Texas option, and we dotted a lot of I's and crossed a lot of T's that solved our issue. And as it began to go statewide, and we were talking to Houston and San Antonio and Austin and rural areas of the state, we found that one size didn't fit all. And what we have to do is, and we're regrouping and we're trying, in efforts like this and working with the commissioners' courts, with other cities, we hope to identify something that's a flexible omnibus bill that redefines TxDOT's role, talks about things like diversions, talks about things like indexing, and also includes an option for local option. And in my mind, TxDOT should be responsible, as they are for superhighways, for working to identify the routes for intercity or interstate transportation. The cities and the counties should be involved in internal transportation issues, and we should be coordinating with each other to find a system. It all works together. When you go to Europe or Washington, D.C. or other areas that have commuter rail, it all goes to intermodal areas of transportation, and that's the success of the program. Going from Austin to Houston would not work if the stations aren't accessible to the people that want to travel. And that's a big debate going on in the city of Fort Worth and Dallas-Fort Worth, is where should the station be, because each one of those stations is an economic development generator. And our belief, frankly, is it should be at DFW Airport, where it's an intermodal. One other point I'd make, I was here earlier when one of your speakers was talking about government. Too often we label ourselves. We did sit in at this table. I call myself a conservative. The commissioner called herself a liberal. And I have found, since I've been on the city council, sometimes I'm a conservative and sometimes I'm a liberal. And it depends on the issue that we're working on. And what our tasking is for all elected officials is to forget about being a conservative or a liberal and start finding solutions for our country and our cities and our county.
So, Judge, what should we do? I'm kidding. Well, being that you're saying, well, conservative, liberal, is the rail itself, at least here in Houston, when we've talked about mass transit, it's tended to have the whole, if you're a Democrat or you're a liberal, you're more pro-mass transit, and if you're the other way, you're not per se against mass transit, just against the whole more fees or other modalities of having to pay for it. Is that going to be a schism statewide?
Well, I think that's really changed a lot in the last 20 years. I mean, it used to be, and again, back in my legislative days, you had people who were either for highways or they were for mass transit.
Right.
And now, that's really a blurred line, which is good. If you go out to the suburbs, which tend, if you just look at voting patterns, they vote conservative, okay, whatever that term means. But they're the first ones to say, why can't I get on a train out front of Kingwood and go to downtown? So I think those lines really are blurred. And I don't think the labels mean anything when it comes to infrastructure anymore. Maybe with some people. But, you know, I could go back and talk to you about election results last spring or in the spring of '08 about the light rail line down Richmond. And you would have thought that I would have been killed on that issue. But that's not what happened. You get one block off of Richmond, and those people voted for that light rail line overwhelmingly in the Republican primary. Or if they were voting on that issue, they voted for me overwhelmingly now.
Right, she told everybody hunker down.
Well, now this was well before that. Hurricane didn't come till September.
That's true.
I think that in terms of the road-rail schism, I think another reason why it's blurred is you brought up the toll authority and that it's spinning off additional revenue. I think that we will find as we move forward looking for funding options that the roads and the rails are symbiotic. They now have a symbiotic relationship. We've seen it in other countries where user fees on roadways through congestion pricing is often used to fund the public transit that runs in the same corridor. When you look at transportation sheds, people, whether they're in a car or whether they're in their own car or in a rail car, are going to want to be traveling in the same corridor. So you can create a circumstance where it is a very positive symbiosis. When one must be traveling by themselves in a car because they have to pick up children and do 5 different things that day and they're going to be going all over the city, they pay a little extra, and that little bit extra goes toward that day later on in the week when they can take a train, possibly even using the same text tag that they used to take a toll road. And that's something we need to be looking at, particularly when you look at the regressivity of utilizing sales tax or property tax to fund these things.
How do you move TxDOT kind of more toward that blurring of the line and symbiote? Do you feel like it's there? Do you feel like TxDOT as an agency is still a little bit behind of what you guys are talking about in the statewide?
There's some really good people inside TxDOT, but the corporate culture at this point is we have no money except to do maintenance on our roads. That's the official line, and they ain't lying.
How do you change that through the legislative process? Is there a way to do so effectively in the next session?
Sure, I can tell you one way, if they just fund some of the railroad funds that they've created.
But do you think the legislative will is there, I guess, would be the question.
Well, I don't know. I gave up trying to guess what the legislature is going to do.
Even when you were in there?
Even when I was there, I didn't try and figure out what they were going to do. But in all seriousness, there is a growing feeling that you cannot just keep building highways. And legislators reflect their constituents. I mean, they really do. It may take a session or two before they come around to that. But I think at the end of the day, if they give TxDOT a pot of money and say, we want you to go do rail, TxDOT will spend the money on rail. And they'll get the people who care about rail to do it.
Mayor, is that the message you try to tell your local representatives?
Yeah, absolutely. We have good buy-in from our local representative, our state senator, and our state rep, and they feel strongly that this process needs to move forward, and they're working to help us do just that.
Why has it taken so long, do you think, in Texas? I mean, we're all talking about, Judge, you were saying, hey, we might see it in your lifetime, and frankly, the rest of the world's like, we're not waiting for y'all, we're moving ahead. Why does it in general take so long, or is that just a myopic way of looking at it? Well,
first, in Texas, we're different from the rest of the world in that
we're our own country.
No, but beyond that, in all seriousness, I mean, I did a lot of transportation all over the world. The rail system developed before the highway system in Europe.
Oh, absolutely.
And so it was there first. In Houston, particularly, passenger rail, other than the trolleys that ran here way back in the 20s or whenever it was, this whole city, this whole community was built around highways and automobiles. So even if you put a transit system in, until it gets to a critical mass, it's hard to make it work. The train that runs from downtown to the Med Center has a lot of ridership. Some people say it has that ridership because they canceled bus lines and forced people onto it. I don't know if that's true or not. But if you look, people are moving to that. And I know you hate to say, if you build it, they will come. But the truth is, if you build it, they will come. But it has to be a system.
And I think a lot of people in the audience, a lot of people are saying, well, I wish we could just snap our fingers and build it already. You know, it would be easier said than done.
Let me give you one more example. The community that is most excited about commuter rail out Hempstead Highway, the commuters obviously are, but Prairie View A&M. Sure. Because suddenly Prairie View becomes a Houston university. Because if you can get on a train, 30 minutes, get off at the campus, it just brings it right into the whole fold.
Do you think, you know, the light rail here in the state has been sporadic. Dallas has, you know, at least you can get from the suburbs into town on Dallas light rail. You can't, frankly, get much of anywhere here in Houston. And there's just not that much that goes on in between. And you're thinking, is it pretty much you guys are in agreement that within 10 years? That, I mean, that seems like a long time. Will we actually see some sort of Houston to Austin corridor in less time than that?
I can tell you, at least from our end of the fish pond, the Manor Elgin line, that portion of the Giddings land is probably the next piece of rail, the next project that we tee up in the Austin MSA after the red line gets rolling. The red line is a portion of the land of Giddings as well. It is, I feel strongly it will be completed easily within a decade, and that will be the western portion of what you're talking about in terms of the Hempstead line.
What about the community, the infrastructure that goes along with when you have actually adequate commuter rail, the jobs or the infrastructure and the build out? How do you see your various communities growing or adapting to a rail line, whatever?
From my standpoint, and I visit with people often about this, and I'm amazed at the number of professors that have come up to me advocating and supporting the high-speed rail concept, from especially from College Station on into Houston, because what they would like, they and their families would like to live in the Houston area, but teach at Texas A&M. So they see a quick 30-minute run over. And then conversely, I see a lot of, I talk to kids whose, or the parents actually, whose kids would like to go to A&M, but they want to live back here in Houston because maybe they have a job they need to come to, so they might take a Monday, Wednesday, Friday schedule, come over to College Station on high-speed rail, attend class, and then return. So I think it's going to open up a whole economic opportunity for a lot of people in a lot of different ways.
And in the Austin area or the Fort Worth area?
In Fort Worth, wherever. If you look at any of the studies that have been done on commuter rail or rail in general, if you put a station in, that creates economic development, that creates jobs. What you see, Arlington, Virginia, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Atlanta, Los Angeles, any of those stations have created economic development that have won in one of the parts of the equation in North Texas is using that incremental economic development to help pay for the process of rail. But those stations generate job and bring communities up, not take communities down. And there is a common belief that transit, quote unquote, brings a community down, and that just simply is not the actual result or the fact. The fact is it brings communities up.
Why is that there a perception like that in some communities?
It's been around for a long time. I lived, 14 years in the D.C. area, and for those of you who have ridden the metro in Washington, D.C., Georgetown specifically didn't want it. And Georgetown now, M Street, is just kind of dumpy compared to places like Silver Spring, which have been revitalized. And so it's been proven wrong time after time. Why people continue to believe it, I don't know. You'd have to get a shrink to tell you that.
The other economic benefit that you see to the kind of development that grows up around these rail stops is that it also seeds that kind of mixed use growth, the kind of walkability and town centers that is so much easier for us to serve with utility, as well as, three of us are living in, all two are living in non-attainment zones, and we are a non-attainment zone, even though we haven't been designated one. We also get the further benefit of a lower lower ground level ozone and a lower per capita BMT.
What do you think, I mean, is the biggest hindrance to things moving forward, is it just money? I mean, is that the simple answer, or is there a more complex way of answering money?
Well, I would add, I think we've each said it a different way, but there's two issues. It's money and who controls the money. Because you do always get, ultimately after, and interestingly, as we did Rail North Texas, I realized that after we defined where the money was going to come from, the last question is always who controls the money. And that's something that needs to be worked out in local areas.
Mayor, you said
And that, I'm just sitting here thinking, that is going to come in the form of education, and what we have to do is inform the citizenry exactly what we're talking about and give them details and specifics, and bring them in as stakeholders. We need to engage the stakeholders in this process. From a high-speed rail standpoint, we're talking about a 100-foot wide footprint is all. And so we're not talking about when you start thinking about going through someone's farmland, we're not talking about a large space of land that will be used for the high-speed rail.
And how loud will it be? You always hear the
It'll be
It's
not
going to be
loud.
noisy. It's going to make everything around my
No,
house shake.
not at all, totally. And keep in mind the definition of the Texas High-Speed Rail Corporation as they are moving forward with this process is we're talking about 200 miles or more. And the definition that they have adopted and the Congress has bought in, Congressman Overstar and his committee, we're talking about 200 miles or in excess of, and that is the definition of high-speed rail. We've ridden that again abroad, as most of you have, and it's quiet. You don't hear it.
What do you need, like the folks here, I mean, everybody wants rail. What do they need to do individually in their own lives on a daily basis to try to help, get it on track, lack of a better term?
I'm about to be facetious now.
You are?
As a start, I'd invite them to come to College Station on Monday, where we'll have a delegation from Spain in for an 8-hour high-speed rail symposium, where we will have the people who put their system together and are currently operating the system in Spain, and to talk to our leadership in the state on high-speed rail. So I'd encourage everyone to come over and spend the day with us in College Station.
If they can't do that, I mean, what else can they do? Should they go call their local state rep? Do they need where does the action actually?
Continue to spread the word, because we took a look at ourselves, what happened last time, and we used that as how can we build on where we were and go forward. And the answer is we've got to build from top down, and we've got to build from bottom up. And we saw that once we felt we were pretty close, and there were some doubts at the top level of government in Austin on this, and the system that opposed us started using Twitter and all the modern technology, and we know now we're going to have to use that to educate the public on what the issue is. And can you imagine a billboard on I-35 when you're locked in traffic that says, if you're not happy with being gridlocked, would you like train, email or call this number? And so the more we can do on both ends of the spectrum, top down and bottom up, the better we can do. So spread the word, keep doing what you're doing. Y'all all drank the Kool-Aid. I saw the chart.
But ultimately, it really is a legislative decision.
It is.
If the legislature, and the next session is the time to really act, because they punted on TxDOT sunset last session. It's up again this time, and now's the time for the legislators to recreate TxDOT, not even to tell TxDOT, but to recreate TxDOT in a way such that they can do rail projects, and then they fund it. And if the legislature does that, it happens. If they don't do that, then local entities will continue to do their best, but you won't have the state. The other real benefit to it is TxDOT is the perfect conduit for federal funding. It's much, much harder for federal funds to flow directly to some local entity. And if it can flow through TxDOT, then that's great. And then the other way is, and and this may terrify some of you, if you're talking about inner city transportation, then maybe we need to get back in bed with Amtrak and talk to the congressional delegation and say, look, why don't we do some projects for Amtrak down here? And Amtrak has the benefit, not to get off into the real nitty-gritty too much, but they are immune from a lot of the liability that other operators would have operating on freight rail lines. So bringing Amtrak in might be a good project also.
So
Let me dovetail on that for a moment. I think we do have to work at the state level in order to revivify TxDOT, particularly in light of the fact that it's so much easier to pull down those federal dollars through them as a conduit. But I would also just make a pitch that we could also push from the ground up to require additional toll revenue, a certain percentage of additional toll revenue to be put toward rail transit in those same corridors. I think we also have to look at TIFs and TERSs and other novel financing approaches along those corridors, knowing that they will become built out in very good and positive ways, so that we can borrow and pay it forward.
We're going to take audience questions here in a second, so think about what you want to ask. And I just want to ask real quick, what do you guys think with the election season coming up statewide, coming up in 2010? We got the census, we got redistricting, all these political things. Is there an ideal electoral map or some sort of legislative makeup that would be best for rail people? Is there a specific formula or not about who should get elected where, in what positions?
Not really. What happened...
Because you said it's up to the legislature.
Right, and I'm trying not to wade into gubernatorial politics here.
Oh, come on.
But the situation when the Trans-Texas corridor was trotted out, it was the perfect political storm. It infuriated urban folks because they said, wait a minute, why are you spending all this money out there where there's not any traffic? And it infuriated rural folks because they said, we don't want your blankety-blank corridor. So that got a lot of people thinking about transportation. And I don't think she'd mind me mentioning her name, but Lois Colcourse, for example, up in Brenham. I was up there, and she thought the rail idea was just a tremendous idea. And it used to be, you know, the rural folks would kind of go, well, you know, we don't care about mass transit or all that. I think the votes are there, but we've got to find a champion. That's the other thing, and I have not dealt with. I'd leave that to people like you. Figure out who the champions are going to be. Maybe it's Senator Watson on the Senate side. Who's it going to be on the House side? Because that's what's got to make it happen.
Mayor, you were going to say something?
Well, I was going
or nod vigorously, one or the other.
No, I agree. I've talked to Lois just not that long ago about this very issue. And what she is hearing, and what from her constituents, what she shared with me is what we mentioned a while ago. You're talking about on the TTC, what was it? The footprint was like a mile or whatever, and with 100 feet in the high-speed rail. So this is resonating with the rural people. They understand that. And then most likely, where possible, at least the plans that I've seen, the high-speed rail will be elevated. So it will actually go through a pasture land where the farmer can continue to plant his crops, run his cattle, drive his truck underneath the high-speed rail.
They can't do that under a highway?
No, not easily.
Questions?
Since I'm going to take the microphone around to people, I'm going to take the advantage of
Oh,
asking the first question.
That's not fair. No.
This morning we heard from Chris Lineberger, who some of you know is a real estate genius who's now with Brookings Institution, and he said two interesting things. One was that the market for sprawl, he called it, has vanished. It's gone. And the other one was that he thought, he specifically said, this idea of building a new loop around Houston was, quote, mad, unquote. So that's in pursuit of a dying paradigm, this sprawl idea of, you know, people living out in the middle of nowhere. The interesting question, though, I think is, and Judge, if you'd like to take this, is why is it so?
I've got to answer this.
Yeah, why is it so easy to scare up $4 or $5 billion to do something like that without a lot of discussion, really? I mean, why is it so hard to get $4 or $5 billion to do rail and transit and so on?
Well, I mean, that's a good question, and you and I have had this conversation many, many times. The Grand Parkway, he may think is mad, but I'm afraid many more people think it's desperately needed to complete the development. And you can shake your head no, but unfortunately I fold on that too, and most people disagree with you, because we do need circle routes, and that will be the last one though. I have no doubt about that. We need to have north-south thoroughfare between 290 and I-10, but we can debate Grand Parkway some other time. Why is it harder, why is it easy to get money for that and not for mass transit or not for rail? Simply because a lot more people are still in their cars, and a lot more people are always going to be in their cars in the foreseeable future, and that's just a fact. Because in our area, even if you had a transit system that took them, where do you take them? Downtown? It's not where everybody works. We have so many employment centers all around that you cannot connect them all by transit in the Houston area. We're going to continue to have arterials and circles, and that's the last one. The Grand Parkway will, I think, in my mind, be the last one. I would also disagree, though. I believe if you put in commuter rail, you're going to see more sprawl. Because now people, what nobody likes to admit, people aren't moving out to the far reaches of Northwest Harris County just because they like the commute. They're moving out there to get out of HISD schools for their kids. And until somebody's willing to admit that, then, you know, you can social science it all you want, and it's not going to get you anywhere. People are not moving out there to get in congestion. So somebody's going to have to address some of the social issues that cause people to move out there. And as long as people move out there, they're going to have automobiles and they're going to want to drive until we provide them with an alternative, which I think will be commuter rail. But that's not going to keep them, that's not going to make them move back in. That's going to make them even more likely to move out there.
May I dovetail on that for a moment? I also think that you have to look at the winners in the highway infrastructure business. There is a well-entrenched lobby, and my dad was a lobbyist for a while, so I don't say lobby with the kind of, you know, sulfuric stench that some people do. But there is an economy around the building of highway infrastructure that is threatened by diversion of those funds off onto rail.
Absolutely.
And that is a fact. And that lobby is not happy about the idea of a very limited amount of transportation resources being siphoned off to another type of infrastructure for which they have no facility to play in.
I think she had a question right here.
That was part of my question, was just if y'all could talk more about the opposition that you have faced and the opposition to the bill you mentioned last session, and just besides the highway building lobby, who else is opposed? What are the other forms of opposition in terms, if you don't want to go gubernatorial politics, okay, but at the bottom and at the top, where is the resistance?
The home builders. That's another interest, very well entrenched interest, because if you have fixed line rail, you have X number of winners. If you have a highway loop, you have X to the 10th power winners in real estate.
And they give a lot of money.
And on a much smaller scale, at the local, real local level at College Station, the pushback we are receiving are from those people who see high-speed rail coming through our community as a growth potential, and they don't want to grow. They're very comfortable, and I preach the same old sermon over and over that you can't prevent growth. Having grown up in Austin, and I saw what happened back in what, 70s, I guess, 60s or 70s, when there was an effort not to grow, and you just cannot prevent it. But this is a pushback we hear in College Station.
But we like the way things are.
Yeah, let's
Just gonna change everything, screw it all up.
Right.
Although one way you can guide it, we don't have a loop in Austin.
Yeah.
And because we don't have a loop, our transportation centers have stayed essentially in the same areas, although we have grown quite a bit in southern Williamson and northern Hughes counties.
And Austin probably has the worst traffic in the state of Texas.
That's actually not true. If you look at the
I've been there.
Worse than ours?
I-35 is jammed both ways all day.
If you look at the TxDOT statistics, actually, I think Houston's traffic is a lot worse.
We just have more cars.
I think competition is the right answer.
Let me make one other point, and this is not my view, but you asked where the opposition is. And Christoph, I'm going to ask you to answer this since you've got the microphone and you've dealt with this. There are a lot of elected officials and others who say, well, wait a minute, you can carry a lot more people on buses, that bus transportation makes a lot more sense than rail, because particularly in a community like Houston, buses can go various places, whereas rail is fixed. And they say, for the same money you spend on rail, if you spent that on really beefing up bus service, you'd be better off. That's where some of the opposition comes from, and that's fair opposition. Now, Christoph's going to tell us if that's right or not.
Well, and I think actually one of the funny things about that is a lot of the same people who, when rail comes up, say we should use buses instead. If you propose to them funding bus service, they'll tell you should fund that either. You know, to some extent, a lot of these debates go back to the fundamental questions about the role of government, really. And, you know, at some point, I think modes don't matter. But the question of do you want to build something good does matter. And I actually think the same thing for commuter rail. Our suburban commuter bus system here is pretty darn amazing. It's a very good system, and the people who use it don't actually care that there's rubber tires underneath. I actually had a different kind of question to sort of change gears here. We've had mention of freight rail as potential corridors for passenger rail, but freight rail also happens to be incredibly energy efficient, incredibly economically efficient, lower environmental impact, and actually picking up market share from trucks. So I was interested in your thoughts on sort of the future of freight rail for carrying freight. Where do you see that developing in the future, and what role do you see that playing in the megaregion?
I think in order to make freight rail as efficient as it can be, you have to move it out of the major population centers so that it can take a larger market share of the trucking industry. And right now, we have a lot of freight rail inside what has become very dense metropolitan areas where it makes it difficult for freight rail to compete with the trucking industry.
Full disclosure, I used to do a lot of work with freight rail, as you well know. One of the problems with what was just said, freight railroads have these inconvenient things called customers, and that's where they have to go. And in our place, the customers are in the metropolitan area, so they can't just go out in the middle of nowhere. That was part of the problem with the Trans-Texas corridor. It's great to go build a new railroad, but if that's not where the railroad's customers are, it doesn't do any good. Now, if you're just talking about container trains like the Alameda corridor, sure, we need to do something like that. And the Houston area, the Gulf Coast, any port really should invest in an Alameda corridor type project to get all the freight out, particularly container traffic. Oh, it's a corridor that comes out of the port of LA Long Beach, and it's below grade most of the time. Major infrastructure project, but it's no grade crossing. You load up container trains, and they come once they leave the port of LA Long Beach. They'll come all the way to St. Louis or Chicago or wherever before they're broken up. But there's no question freight rail is going to continue. But at the end of every move, it has to be put on a truck. And then talk about paradigm shifts. We need to come up with a whole new system of trucking so that railroads can compete better on the less than 400 to 500 mile hauls, like between here and Dallas, for example. That should all go by rail, and way too much of it goes by truck now.
I'd just add to that, because in Fort Worth, one of the greatest economic generators we have is Alliance Airport. Alliance Airport, I say airport, it's an intermodal. It's where freight and air and trucks come together. And because of the world's greatest parking lot, I-35, it is getting more and more difficult to grow that business. But every time we build a road in a city, we have to negotiate with the railroad company that has to move freight. And I will say, we, as elected officials in a city, do not want to interfere in any way. We want to increase the capacity of freight, because it is to our benefit economically to be able to move freight. The difficulty that we come into with commuter rail is right-of-way, and we get the right-of-way difficulty whether it be commuter rail or roads. If we can coexist, in most of the time it means more tracks, and that, I don't know if y'all have heard of Tower 55 that is in Fort Worth, but Tower 55 is one of the busiest intersections in the nation, where over 200 trains, depending on, right now it's about 120 trains a day, go through literally one intersection, either going north-south or east-west. As a result, those trains are lined up on 36 rail lines out in the suburbs waiting to get through that one intersection. And that's creating a significant problem. That's just freight. And we don't want to complicate that, so we've got a rail relocation project. We're asking for stimulus money to solve the Tower 55 problem, and we think we're going to be able to do that. So.
Any more questions out there? Somebody else? This lady back here.
Thanks, although I microphone. Anyway, I wanted to ask a little bit about one of the things that we found in the Megaregions was the different infrastructure discussions of water and green infrastructure and everything else. And one of the things that comes up with rail over and over again, as with highways, is that transportation is the infrastructure that drives where development happens. But one of the things is that what kind of development you get is not determined by the rail. I mean, if you have a rail line, it doesn't mean you get a good walkable community. That depends on a whole list of other things, and whether you get parks in it depends on whether you fund parks and so forth. And so this is kind of a long way of saying, if we are promoting rail, what do you think about the chances of getting some coordination with other infrastructure so that we're putting the water and the green infrastructure and the sidewalks and the bike paths where we want the development along the rail to happen, as opposed to just putting the rail in and then seeing what happens next. So.
In Fort Worth, we call that our comprehensive plan, and Vision North Texas plays in that. But what you find very quickly in government is that everything you do, what's the rule that for every action there's a reaction? In government, everything is, in life, everything is related. So we have to make sure that we've been comprehensive in understanding where the water, the sewer, the roads, the rail, all of it comes together. And in the case of Texas, Fort Worth, we're in non-attainment. But that bad air is not coming from Fort Worth, Texas. It's coming from southeast of the Metroplex, away from us. It's blowing across Fort Worth, Texas. So we have to coordinate regionally to solve the regional problems.
I think we can also work through our MPOs and our 25-year plans to push the idea of activity centers and a nodal type strategy for how we spend our infrastructure dollars, coordinating it with where our water infrastructure is, where our green print is, and having that kind of regional coordination. I know that at least in the Central Texas region, we have not exerted that kind of discipline as far as a 25-year plan that also takes into consideration what our current activity nodes are and what we expect to be future activity nodes. And a lot of that is due to entrenched interests. The private sector doesn't want the public sector to dictate where the activity center 25 years from now is going to be. But it's very difficult to plan if you don't do at least some of that.
Are we really big into planning in Harris County and Houston?
I'm sorry?
Are we really big into planning in Harris County and Houston?
You know, I don't need to answer that. About Houston, we all know that story very well. But let me mention about Harris County, because this does come into play. Harris County is different from almost every other county, if not in the state and the country, because the city of Houston's quit annexing. We have subdivisions that have been built 40 years ago that thought they were going to be annexed, and they're not. If you look at the storm sewer covers, they say City of Houston, but they're not in the City of Houston. In fact, if you took the unincorporated part of Harris County, that part's that's not in any municipality, it would be the 7th largest city in the U.S. And yet, we don't have ordinance making power. What are we going to do when those subdivisions start wearing out? And I've had this conversation with many of you in this room. You know, something as simple as the packaged water treatment plants that each subdivision has. They wear out. Does the mud replace them subdivision by subdivision, or do we go to a regional water quality system? Well, I think we ought to go to a regional water quality system. But again, you're back at the legislature. How do you get that done? Well, when you start talking about things like communities and nodal interest and what's built around these, we don't have any way of really controlling that. And if the city of Houston isn't going to get into that, the odds of the legislature giving Harris County that are zero.
And it's always interesting too with a lot of developers who are interested in rail and what it could bring. They're trying to like guess where it's going to go so they can go put their money there. And maybe the rail will go there, and then maybe they'll hit the jackpot and be able to develop all these fanciful, wonderful things, and maybe not. And there's kind of, you know, don't know where that's going to go. But I thought we had a question back there too. Yes, sir.
Let's assume that we have, in 10 years, the Texas Triangle high-speed rail system, whether it's the T-bone or the Triangle or whatever. Where do you see it going beyond that? Do we actually tap into the national network of north to Oklahoma City, west to El Paso, east to New Orleans and beyond? And how important it is for some entity somewhere to establish a standard that is then used nationally, so that we don't have a whole bunch of mixed bag systems.
Let me maybe start in the response. Serving on the board of the corporation, the Texas High Speed Rail Corporation, I can tell you that the city of Oklahoma City has since joined the corporation, and they now are proposing to be on the route going north of Dallas. I can tell you that North Little Rock, Arkansas has joined, and they will be on the route from Dallas over to Texarkana and the North Little Rock on to Memphis. The city of Corpus Christi is interested, and they would like to have it teed off coming down out of San Antonio into Corpus Christi, and even cities in the valley have expressed interest. From Houston, the plan is to go on to Beaumont and to New Orleans to the east. Now that's what's on the plans at this point in time.
But they got to build the Triangle or the T-bone first?
Right.
One of those.
Well, yeah, this is predicated on it being the T-bone.
Lady back there?
Back to the land use question that was asked, since the location of water systems and muds is one of the biggest things driving our growth, and part of that is because of the legislative mandates that we have to give people water wherever they want to live, what's the likelihood of reassessing that as a way of encouraging growth where it makes more sense to have it?
Slim and none. I mean, you know, just being really honest. And the growth pattern, I hate for this to just be a Harris County or Houston-centric discussion, but I was with a city council member not long ago, and she was bemoaning the fact that the 3rd Ward over by Texas Southern, that the nature of the community is changing because people are moving in and paying a lot of money for those lots, and now they're building big houses in there, and different people are living there than who used to live there. And I reminded her that I remember when that was the major Jewish community before it became the major black community, and you just walk this fine line when people start talking about controlling who lives where and why. And the question I asked her that I didn't get a good answer, and I won't mention his name, but probably
I'll take a guess. No, I'm kidding.
The most prominent home builder. I said, well, what do you tell the 80-year-old lady whose husband died 20 years ago when Mr. So-and-so comes to her and says, I'll give you $400,000 for this basic shack that you live in? Are you going to tell her she can't take that? You can't. And the same thing applies, you know, suburbs, wherever you want to go. And as long as people are going to want to make those individual decisions of where they live. I think what's beneficial about commuter rail and having mass transit, more and more people, I'll use myself as an example. When I was appointed to the Interstate Commerce Commission and moved to the Washington, D.C. area, I didn't even own a car. I sold my car because the D.C. metro system was such that I thought, why should I keep a car here? And if I needed a car on the weekend, it was easier to go rent one, a lot cheaper. Well, my kids all think like that, and I think the younger generation will begin to think like that. And a lot of this will I hate to say it, but it will take care of itself almost without government forcing it. Maybe I'm being Pollyannish there, but I think that's correct.
I agree with the judge to the extent that it's true the Texas legislature is not giving counties the authority to regulate growth in these unincorporated regions anytime soon. But in terms of, we have a little bit of a different circumstance in the Travis County, Austin MSA area, which perhaps makes us unique in relation to Houston, but not unique in the state of Texas. Our water infrastructure is, we have more pumping and processing capacity than we actually have water. And while the legislature has long ago kicked open the barn doors for MUDs and whatnot in order to spur growth in the ETJ and in the rural areas, what we're seeing now is you can lay down the infrastructure, but if there's no water to pump through the infrastructure, that's going to be a natural limit on the growth. And what I've found, particularly with our unique environmental circumstances in Travis County, is that we are a property rights state, but it's a special type of property rights. It's property rights for those who can afford to defend them. There are no property rights really per se for someone who cannot.
I think we're close to about 4 o'clock. I think we'll just wrap it up. I see the time signs. Is there any final thoughts? We'll start with you, Mayor. We can go down the line. If anybody has some final thoughts, we'll just
Well, I would just echo what my colleagues have said, and we've all said repeatedly for the last hour and a half from a high-speed rail standpoint, and probably mass transit or commuter rail or whatever. It's going to be education, it's going to be awareness, and we need to continue to preach the sermon and sell the product.
Commissioner? I just thank you all for being here and stay on the issue. I think it's going to come, but it'll come faster with each one of you doing what you can at the local level to make it happen.
Councilmember.
I want to thank you as well for being here. I hope you can see the passion among my colleagues sitting at this table. They share the passion that you have, and we just look forward to working together to move this along, because the judge said it, and I think most things that are major changes require cultural changes, and cultural changes take a while to make happen. And we just have to be tenacious to make this happen.
All of us need to look for the opportunities as they arise. For example, UP says we're going to give you this freight rail track. Well, let's use it. Let's not let it go away like we did back on I-10. BNSF says we want to open up a track for high-speed rail. Let's work with, T-Bone folks, the High-Speed Rail Corporation. They'd probably be willing to say, well, we can modify our plan. Let's not get locked into saying this is the way it's got to be, because we've never done this before. So we need to be fairly flexible.
Work in progress.
Work in progress.
Thank you both.